Marta adjusted her apron with trembling hands as she gazed at the brightly lit mansion ahead of her. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, with its towering spires, glittering lights, and gardens scented with roses and jasmine. Every detail exuded wealth and opulence, a direct reflection of the evening's hostess, her older sister, Beatrice. Marta felt a tight knot in her throat every time she passed through those gilded gates, not as a guest, but as a waitress, serving cocktails to an elite crowd that didn't even know her name. Walking toward the back entrance, the worn heels of her shoes clicked against the polished stone driveway. The sound contrasted sharply with the faint laughter and chatter in the distance, filled with the confidence of people whose lives sparkled like their diamonds. The divide between Marta's simple world and Beatrice's luxurious one had never felt so stark. Even the air seemed lighter here, as though reserved only for the privileged. Inside the house, Marta couldn't keep her mind from racing. She loved Beatrice, but money had become an invisible wall between them. Beatrice never outright dismissed her, but her words always carried a patronizing undertone, as if Marta existed only through her wealthier sister's generosity. "You're so hard-working, Marta," Beatrice had said once, her tone dripping with pity. "But not everyone is meant to shine, you know." That line echoed in Marta's mind, each syllable biting like a truth she couldn't escape. Balancing trays of champagne and avoiding disinterested gazes, Marta stumbled upon a thought she hadn't dared entertain before. What if her life had been like Beatrice's? People always said money couldn't buy happiness, but it could buy nearly everything else: education, security, respect. Respect was what Marta craved most. Not pity or condescension, but genuine acknowledgement of her worth. As she moved through the lavish party, Marta's focus wavered when she caught the sound of familiar laughter. Beatrice stood near the grand fireplace, surrounded by a small circle of admirers. Her black designer gown hugged her figure perfectly, her blonde hair styled into a flawless chignon. She moved with the practiced elegance of someone who knew they were always being watched. Marta looked away, determined to keep her head down and focus on her work, but she couldn't help overhearing snippets of the conversation. "My little sister has always had a special talent for avoiding success," Beatrice said with a soft laugh. "It's almost admirable in a way." The words landed like a slap. Marta clenched her jaw, but forced herself to stay composed. A guest beckoned her over, and she resumed her duties, feeling the sting of her sister's mockery like a weight on her chest. But as she turned away from the scene, she noticed something unusual. A man stood at the edge of the room, watching her intently. He wasn't laughing, nor did he seem caught up in the dazzling allure of the party. His expression was one of curiosity, almost intrigue. Their eyes met briefly, before Marta lowered her gaze and moved on. Later, while stacking empty glasses in the kitchen, Marta couldn't shake the memory of his gaze. It wasn't something she was used to, being noticed. Who was he? Why had he seemed so interested? She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand, but deep within her, a new feeling began to stir. It wasn't just frustration or sadness, it was a faint flicker of defiance, a yearning for something more. What if? The thought lingered in the back of her mind, unfinished, as one of her colleagues called her name to help with another tray. Marta snapped back to reality, but that small, rebellious spark remained, refusing to fade. And speaking of sparks, if you're already feeling that this story is something special, let us know in the comments below. What do you think Marta should do next? Your thoughts inspire us to keep these stories alive, so don't hold back. Leave your comment and be part of this journey. Back in the party, the journalist who had been watching her was nowhere to be seen. The tray in Marta's hands felt heavier as she moved through the crowded room, the mansion's opulence pressing down on her. But it wasn't just the weight of her work. Something inside her was shifting, a quiet rebellion taking root, with consequences she could barely begin to imagine. The early morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Marta's modest apartment, casting pale golden streaks on the peeling wallpaper. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside. Marta sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers absently tracing the chipped edge of her coffee cup. She had slept little after the party, her thoughts looping relentlessly. Beatrice's words still echoed in her mind, sharp and unforgiving, like a wound that refused to heal. Her gaze wandered to the small pile of bills stacked neatly on the table: rent, utilities, groceries. Each envelope represented another layer of pressure, a reminder that her world revolved around survival, not ambition. For years, she had convinced herself that she didn't need the wealth or power that defined Beatrice's life. She had embraced simplicity, found comfort in her routines. But now, that comfort felt hollow, as if something vital had been missing all along. Marta stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. She moved to the window, looking out at the city below. The world seemed so vast, yet she felt caged, unable to break free from the limitations that defined her existence. Her hands tightened into fists as a surge of frustration coursed through her. How had she ended up here? Was this all her life would ever be? An endless cycle of bills, early shifts, and invisible struggles. Her thoughts were interrupted by the insistent buzz of her phone. Glancing at the screen, she saw Beatrice's name flashing. Marta hesitated before answering, her voice carefully neutral. "Hello?" "Marta." Beatrice's tone was as polished as ever, carrying that familiar mix of warmth and superiority. "I need your help with something." Marta's brow furrowed. Beatrice never called unless she needed something. "What is it?" There was a pause on the other end, and then Beatrice's voice softened, as if she were trying to sound genuinely concerned. "I have a situation at one of my companies. It's nothing serious, but I could use an extra set of hands. You're always so dependable, and I thought of you." Dependable. The word hung in the air, both a compliment and a dismissal. Marta fought the urge to snap back, to remind Beatrice that she wasn't a convenience to be summoned at will. But instead, she swallowed her pride. "What kind of help?" she asked cautiously. "It's just some organizational work, nothing you can't handle," Beatrice replied smoothly. "I'll send a car to pick you up tomorrow morning." Marta wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell Beatrice to find someone else, to solve her own problems, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe a quiet determination to prove that she was more than just dependable. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll be there." The call ended, and Marta sat back down, staring at her phone as if it held all the answers she sought. A mix of resentment and anticipation churned in her chest. She didn't trust Beatrice's motives, but the opportunity felt like a door cracking open, offering a glimpse of a world she had only ever observed from the sidelines. The following morning, Marta stood outside her apartment building, waiting for the sleek black car Beatrice had promised. When it arrived, the driver, impeccably dressed, opened the door for her without a word. Marta slid into the back seat, her nerves tingling. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into something far more complex than Beatrice had let on. The office was located in a towering skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. The polished marble floors and gleaming glass walls spoke of power and prestige, a world so far removed from Marta's reality that it felt almost surreal. Beatrice greeted her in the lobby, her smile as dazzling as the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "You're going to love this," Beatrice said, linking her arm with Marta's and leading her toward the elevators. "It's a chance to step into my world for a bit. Who knows? You might even enjoy it." Marta said nothing, her jaw tightening. The elevator ride was silent, save for the soft ding of floors passing by. When they stepped out, Marta found herself in a sprawling office with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Beatrice gestured toward a desk piled high with papers. "Just some basic organization," Beatrice said lightly. "It's a mess, but I knew you could handle it." Marta nodded, though her stomach churned. As she sifted through the documents, she began to notice something odd. Amid the contracts and financial statements were notes scribbled hastily in the margins, references to debts and partnerships that didn't quite add up. She frowned, her curiosity piqued. Was this what Beatrice needed help with, or was it something she didn't want anyone else to see? By the end of the day, Marta's head swam with questions. The numbers didn't lie. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, with Beatrice's finances. As she left the office, Beatrice's voice echoed in her mind. "It's nothing serious." But Marta wasn't so sure, and for the first time, she felt a strange sense of power, knowing something that Beatrice didn't think she would understand. Outside, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, casting a golden glow over the streets. Marta stood on the curb, her breath visible in the cool evening air. She clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing. What was Beatrice hiding? And why had she chosen Marta to help her? The office was quieter than Marta had expected when she arrived the next morning. The sleek, modern decor, with its sharp angles and cold steel accents, felt almost intimidating. Beatrice had barely given her instructions before leaving her alone in the vast space. It was as if Marta's presence there was a mere formality, a way for her sister to say she'd done someone a favor without actually caring about the results. Marta settled into the desk she'd been assigned, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface. The documents from the previous day were still scattered in disarray, but now, armed with a clearer head and a sharper sense of curiosity, she dove back into them. Line by line, she sifted through the contracts, invoices, and financial statements. Her initial unease began to morph into fascination. Beneath the polished surface of Beatrice's empire lay something far more fragile than she had imagined. One file caught her attention, a contract with terms so vague it seemed designed to obfuscate. Marta's brow furrowed as she traced the name of a company listed as a partner. She recognized it from a whispered conversation she'd overheard at the party. It wasn't a name associated with legitimate business dealings. A chill ran down her spine. What was Beatrice doing? And why was she so reckless with something as volatile as money? Hours passed, the rhythm of her work interrupted only by the occasional footsteps of an assistant hurrying down the hall. Marta became so engrossed in her task that she didn't notice someone approach until a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to see a tall man in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable. "You must be Marta," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Raphael. Beatrice mentioned you'd be helping out." Marta studied him carefully. His presence was commanding, his sharp features and confident stance a stark contrast to the bland politeness of the other employees she had encountered. "Yes," she said simply, her tone guarded. "I'm just trying to get through all of this." Raphael's gaze flicked to the pile of documents in front of her. Impressive. Most people wouldn't have the patience for this kind of work. She couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a veiled criticism. "Well, I'm not most people." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Clearly not." He lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the desk as if he were looking for something specific. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Marta with more questions than answers. By the end of the day, Marta's unease had grown. There was something off about Raphael, his interest in her work, his enigmatic demeanor. It was as if he knew more about the situation than he let on. But she couldn't dwell on that now. What mattered were the discrepancies she had uncovered in the financial records. They painted a picture of a business teetering on the edge, held together by precarious deals and promises that seemed doomed to collapse. Marta left the office feeling a mix of dread and exhilaration. For the first time, she saw cracks in Beatrice's perfect world. The thought gave her a strange sense of satisfaction. Her sister's life wasn't as untouchable as it appeared, and that realization fueled a determination Marta hadn't known she possessed. That evening, as she sat at her small kitchen table, Marta laid out her findings in front of her. She had jotted down notes, piecing together connections that made little sense on the surface, but hinted at something much bigger beneath. Debt, risk, fragile partnerships. It was a puzzle she was only beginning to understand, but she knew one thing for certain: if Beatrice wasn't careful, her entire empire could crumble. The knock on her door startled her, breaking her train of thought. Marta hesitated before answering, her heart pounding. To her surprise, it was Raphael. He stood in the dim hallway, his hands in his pockets, his expression as composed as ever. "Apologies for showing up unannounced," he said. "But I thought we should talk." Marta stared at him, her mind racing. "How did you find me?" "I make it a point to know who I'm working with," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "And I think you've stumbled onto something you don't fully understand." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Raphael stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The small space of her apartment suddenly felt claustrophobic. "Your sister has been making moves that put more than her company at risk. You're in deeper than you realize, Marta." She crossed her arms, trying to mask her unease. "Then maybe you should explain." His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the silence was almost unbearable. "There's a lot at stake here," he said finally. "And if you're not careful, you could get caught in the fallout." Marta's chest tightened, her mind spinning with possibilities. She didn't trust Raphael, but his words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Something bigger was at play, and she was no longer sure she wanted to be part of it. Yet despite the fear gnawing at her, a spark of defiance remained. She had come too far to back down now. The city seemed quieter that morning, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Marta found herself staring at her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls as she rode up to Beatrice's office. Her mind replayed Raphael's cryptic warning, the weight of his words lingering like a shadow. She had spent hours dissecting his tone, his expression, searching for hidden motives. But no matter how she turned it over, one truth remained. Something dangerous was unfolding, and she was now firmly entangled in it. As the elevator doors opened, Marta stepped into the office, greeted by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. Beatrice was seated at her expansive desk, flipping through documents with the nonchalance of someone who had mastered the art of pretending nothing was wrong. Marta hesitated in the doorway, taking in the picture of calm her sister presented, a stark contrast to the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. "You're late," Beatrice said without looking up. Marta ignored the jab, walking to her desk and setting down her bag. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Beatrice, we need to talk about these financials." That caught her sister's attention. Beatrice raised her head, her perfectly shaped brows arching. "What about them?" "There are gaps," Marta said, her voice steady but firm. "Contracts that don't make sense, debts you haven't disclosed. I don't know how you're keeping things afloat, but it won't last." For a moment, Beatrice's mask of composure slipped. Her jaw tightened and her eyes narrowed. "Marta, you have no idea what you're talking about. Stay in your lane." "Don't patronize me," Marta snapped, surprising even herself with the force of her words. "I've seen the numbers, Beatrice. This isn't just about bad management. This is a ticking time bomb, and if you don't start being honest, it's going to explode." Beatrice leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You think you're so clever, don't you? digging around in things that don't concern you. It concerns me when you drag me into your mess, Marta shot back, and don't act like I don't know what's at stake. Raphael came to me last night. That struck a nerve. Beatrice's expression hardened, and for the first time, Marta saw something close to fear flicker in her sister's eyes. What did he tell you? Enough to make me question everything, Marta said. Who is he, Beatrice? What does he want? Beatrice hesitated, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and guarded. Raphael is complicated. He's an investor, but he's not someone you want to cross. He's helped keep things together, but his patience has limits. If he's talking to you, it's because he sees an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Marta pressed. Beatrice shook her head, standing abruptly and walking to the window. She gazed out at the city skyline, her back to Marta. I've made mistakes, okay? Big ones. But you don't understand what it's like to hold everything together, to have everyone watching, waiting for you to fail. Sometimes you do things you're not proud of just to keep going. Marta stood as well, her voice softening. You don't have to do it alone, Beatrice, but you need to be honest, with me, with yourself. Otherwise, you're just digging a deeper hole. Beatrice didn't respond, her shoulders tense as she continued to stare out the window. Marta took a step closer, her frustration giving way to something more vulnerable. You brought me here for a reason. If you didn't trust me, you wouldn't have asked for my help. Let me in, Beatrice. Let me help you. The words hung in the air, unanswered. Marta finally turned and walked back to her desk, the conversation leaving her drained but resolute. She wouldn't let Beatrice brush this aside. Not this time. Later that afternoon, Raphael appeared again, his presence as unsettling as ever. Marta had barely had time to process her morning confrontation when he strolled into the office, his sharp eyes scanning the room. We need to talk, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marta followed him into the hallway, her heart pounding. Once they were alone, Raphael leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable. I heard about your little conversation with Beatrice. You're in deeper than I thought. I'm just trying to understand what's going on, Marta said, her voice firmer than she felt. Beatrice is desperate, Raphael said bluntly. She's made deals she can't keep, borrowed from people who won't wait forever, and now she's running out of options. Why are you telling me this? Marta asked, narrowing her eyes. What do you want from me? I want you to understand the stakes, Raphael said. This isn't just about numbers on a page, it's about control, power. And if you're not careful, you could become collateral damage. Marta's stomach churned at his words, but she refused to back down. I won't be anyone's pawn, Raphael. If you think I'm just going to stand by and watch this fall apart, you're wrong. A faint smile played at the corners of his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. Good. I'd hate to think I misjudged you. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Marta alone in the hallway. Her thoughts raced, a mix of fear and determination building inside her. The cracks in Beatrice's empire were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But Marta wasn't sure who she could trust, or if she could trust anyone at all. The opulence of the gala was stifling. Every inch of the grand ballroom sparkled, from the crystal chandeliers overhead to the polished marble floors that reflected the glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos of the attendees. Marta moved through the crowd, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes, though none of them seemed to see her. She wasn't one of them. She never had been. Yet here she was, standing in the center of a world that had always treated her as invisible. Beatrice had insisted on Marta's presence, though her motives were far from altruistic. You're part of the family, Beatrice had said with a dismissive wave of her hand. It's time people saw that. But Marta knew better, Her sister needed someone she could control, someone to deflect attention from the cracks in her carefully curated image. And tonight, those cracks were growing more visible. As the night unfolded, Marta couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension that hummed through the room. Conversations seemed strained, laughter forced. She noticed Raphael standing near the bar, his expression as unreadable as ever. He was speaking to a man Marta didn't recognize, but the intensity of their exchange made her uneasy. There was something dangerous about the way Raphael carried himself tonight, as if he were playing a game no one else understood. Marta's thoughts were interrupted when Beatrice approached, her diamond earrings catching the light as she leaned in close. "Marta," she said in a low voice, her tone sharp. "Stop lurking and make yourself useful. Go talk to Mr. Wallace. He's the one by the piano. Tell him how well we're doing." "Excuse me." Marta frowned, taken aback by the demand. "What am I supposed to say?" "Just make it convincing," Beatrice hissed before gliding away, her smile plastered back on as she greeted another guest. Left with little choice, Marta made her way to the piano, her steps measured. Mr. Wallace, an older man with a salt and pepper beard and piercing blue eyes, greeted her with a polite nod. "You must be Marta," he said, his voice warm but curious. "Beatrice mentioned you." "Did she?" Marta asked, forcing a smile. "She has a way of making introductions." Wallace chuckled, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So, tell me, Marta, what do you think of the business? Beatrice speaks highly of your contributions." Marta hesitated, her pulse quickening. The air between them felt charged, as though Wallace was testing her. "It's challenging," she said carefully, "but we're making progress." Wallace studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Interesting. You don't strike me as someone who settles for mediocrity." Marta blinked, caught off guard by the comment. Before she could respond, Wallace's attention shifted, his gaze landing on Raphael, who had moved closer to their conversation. The tension in the room seemed to spike as Raphael approached, his eyes locking with Wallace's. "Mr. Wallace," Raphael said smoothly, his voice carrying an edge that sent a shiver down Marta's spine. "I see you've met Marta." "We were just getting acquainted," Wallace replied, his tone measured. Raphael turned his attention to Marta, his expression unreadable. "Beatrice is looking for you. She's expecting an update." The words felt like a dismissal, and Marta didn't miss the subtle warning in Raphael's tone. She excused herself, leaving the two men to their veiled conversation. As she walked away, her chest tightened with frustration. She was tired of being a pawn in Beatrice's game, tired of the secrets and manipulations that seemed to engulf everyone in this world. But her frustration quickly turned to unease when she spotted Beatrice across the room, locked in a heated argument with a man Marta recognized from the office. A creditor. Their voices were low, but the intensity of their exchange was palpable. Beatrice's smile faltered, replaced by a mask of barely restrained panic. Marta's stomach churned. The cracks in her sister's empire weren't just widening, they were threatening to split it apart entirely. Before Marta could intervene, the lights dimmed and a spotlight illuminated the stage at the far end of the ballroom. Beatrice stepped forward, her smile forced but dazzling as she addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing out with practiced confidence. "Thank you for joining us tonight. This evening is a celebration of success, of resilience, of—" Her words faltered as the man she'd been arguing with moments earlier stepped into the light, his expression smug. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, "but I think it's time we discussed the truth behind that resilience." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Marta felt her heart drop as Beatrice's composure cracked. The man continued, his tone dripping with derision. For years, Beatrice has been spinning tales of wealth and power, but behind the scenes it's nothing but smoke and mirrors, debts, shady deals, and now, desperation. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and scandal. Beatrice stood frozen, her face pale. Marta's chest tightened as she watched her sister's carefully constructed facade crumble in an instant. But amid the chaos, Marta felt a strange surge of determination. This was her moment, not to gloat or retreat, but to take control. As the crowd swarmed with questions and accusations, Marta moved forward, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she would say or do, but she couldn't stand idly by, not anymore. The aftermath of the public humiliation lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The ballroom, once alive with glittering laughter and champagne toasts, now felt hollow. Beatrice had retreated to the private lounge upstairs, leaving Marta to deal with the murmuring crowd and their speculative stares. As whispers of scandal rippled through the room, Marta realized this wasn't just a crack in Beatrice's empire. It was the beginning of its collapse. Marta followed her sister upstairs, the quiet of the corridor amplifying her own racing thoughts. When she reached the lounge, she found Beatrice slumped on a velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands. The confident, polished woman who had dominated every room she entered was gone, replaced by someone fragile, almost unrecognizable. "Beatrice," Marta began carefully, stepping inside. Beatrice didn't look up. "I told you to stay downstairs." "And leave you here like this?" Marta countered, her voice firmer. "No, you need to talk to me." Beatrice finally lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy. "What's there to talk about? You saw what happened. It's over." Marta moved closer, pulling a chair to sit across from her. "It's not over unless you let it be, but I need you to be honest with me. How bad is it?" Beatrice hesitated, her gaze shifting to the ornate rug beneath their feet. For a moment, Marta thought she might shut her out again, but then the words came tumbling out, raw and unfiltered. "It's worse than you think. The debts, the deals, I can't keep up anymore. And Raphael..." She stopped herself, her jaw tightening. "What about Raphael?" Marta pressed. Beatrice's lips trembled. "He's not just an investor, he's a fixer. He doesn't just manage money, he controls people, and when they can't pay, he collects in ways you don't want to imagine." Marta's stomach churned. She had suspected Raphael wasn't entirely above board, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why drag me into this if you knew how dangerous it was?" "Because I didn't have a choice." Beatrice snapped, her voice breaking. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could fix everything before it came to this." Marta sat back, her mind racing. The situation was worse than she'd imagined. Beatrice's empire wasn't just crumbling. It was imploding, taking everyone in its orbit down with it. And now, Marta was caught in the middle. "You need to confront Raphael," Marta said finally. "You need to end this." Beatrice let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that simple? He doesn't let go. If I try to back out now, he'll destroy me." Marta leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "He already is. The only way out of this is to face him head-on." The room fell silent, the weight of Marta's words pressing down on both of them. Beatrice looked at her sister, something shifting in her gaze. For the first time, there was a flicker of trust, a recognition that Marta wasn't just there to clean up her mess. She was there to fight alongside her. The following day, Marta returned to the office with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let fear paralyze her. Beatrice may have created this mess, but Marta was determined to find a way out, even if it meant taking on Raphael herself. When Raphael arrived later that afternoon, his usual air of calm authority was firmly in place. He stepped into Marta's office unannounced, closing the door behind him. "You've been busy," he said, his tone deceptively casual. Marta didn't flinch. "I've been trying to clean up the mess you helped create." Raphael raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Careful, Marta. Accusations like that can get you into trouble." "Only if they're false," she shot back, her voice steady. "I know what you've been doing, using Beatrice's desperation to tighten your grip, but you underestimated one thing." "And what's that?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "Me," Marta said firmly. "I'm not afraid of you, Raphael, and I'm not going to let you destroy my sister." Raphael leaned back, studying her with a mix of amusement and intrigue. "You're bold, I'll give you that, but boldness won't save you in this world." "Neither will fear," Marta replied. "So let's stop playing games. What do you really want?" Raphael's smile faded, his demeanor shifting. "What I want is simple: control. Your sister promised me returns, and I intend to collect." "And what if I can give you something better?" Marta asked, her mind racing. Raphael's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Marta hesitated, knowing she was walking a fine line. "Give me time. Let me stabilize the company. If I can show you results, you back off. No more threats, no more manipulation." Raphael considered her words, the silence between them heavy with tension. Finally, he nodded. "You have 1 month. If you fail, the consequences are on you." As Raphael left, Marta sank into her chair, her hands trembling. She didn't know if she could pull it off, but she wasn't going to back down. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Marta stood at the large conference table, a cascade of documents and spreadsheets spread before her. The tension in the room was palpable as she faced a group of skeptical executives, their expressions a mix of doubt and impatience. Each set of eyes seemed to question her presence, her authority. This was Beatrice's world, a world of sharp suits, precise language, and high-stakes decisions. But today, Marta wasn't here as a bystander. She was here to take control. Her voice was steady as she began her presentation, though the weight of the stakes pressed heavily on her chest. "These are the projections based on the recovery plan I've drafted. With immediate restructuring and renegotiation of key contracts, we can stabilize the company's finances within 3 months." One of the executives, an older man with silver hair and a piercing gaze, leaned back in his chair, his skepticism evident. "And what experience do you have managing something of this scale?" Marta met his gaze without flinching. "None," she admitted. "But I've spent the last 2 weeks untangling the mess your seasoned leadership team allowed to fester. What I lack in experience, I make up for in clarity and determination." A murmur rippled through the room. Marta felt the heat of their judgment, but she refused to back down. She had spent sleepless nights poring over every detail of the company's operations, identifying the weak points and hidden risks. She knew the stakes were higher than just the company's survival. This was about proving she wasn't the shadow of her sister, that she could stand on her own. When the meeting adjourned, Marta returned to her temporary office, her pulse racing. She had fought to be heard, but the battle was far from over. The executives weren't just questioning her, they were waiting for her to fail, and failure wasn't an option. As the hours dragged on, Marta immersed herself in the work. Her desk was a flurry of notes, contracts, and financial reports. She was determined to meet the deadline Raphael had imposed, even if it meant pushing herself to the brink. But as the days passed, a new challenge emerged. Raphael's influence was deeper than she had anticipated. She discovered subtle roadblocks in her efforts, contracts that suddenly became inaccessible, partners who grew unresponsive. It was as though invisible strings were being pulled to tighten the noose around her plans. Marta knew it was Raphael's doing, a calculated test to see if she would crack under the pressure. One evening, as Marta sat alone in the dimly lit office, Beatriz appeared at the door. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by something raw, almost vulnerable. She lingered for a moment before stepping inside. "You're really doing it," Beatriz said softly, her tone a mix of awe and disbelief. Marta looked up, her exhaustion evident. "What choice do I have?" Beatriz hesitated, then walked over to the desk, her eyes scanning the chaos of papers. "You don't have to do this alone." Marta's gaze hardened. "I'm cleaning up your mess, Beatriz. The least you can do is stay out of my way." "That's not fair," Beatriz said, her voice trembling. "You think I wanted this? You think I don't regret every mistake I made?" "Regret doesn't fix anything," Marta shot back. "Action does, and that's what I'm trying to do while you hide from your responsibilities." Beatriz's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Marta saw the cracks in her sister's armor, the fear, the shame, the overwhelming weight of failure. "I'm sorry," Beatriz whispered, her voice barely audible. The apology caught Marta off guard, and for a moment her anger softened. She gestured to an empty chair. "If you really want to help, sit down. We have a lot of work to do." Beatriz hesitated, then sat, her hands trembling as she picked up a stack of papers. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of something different, a partnership forged in the crucible of desperation. As the sisters worked late into the night, Marta couldn't shake the feeling that Raphael was watching, waiting for her to slip. His shadow loomed over every decision, every step she took, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, Marta met with Raphael in a sleek, minimalist cafe that exuded the kind of understated luxury he seemed to thrive in. He greeted her with a faint smile, his eyes scanning her face as though searching for signs of weakness. "You're pushing hard," he said, sipping his espresso. "Impressive, but I wonder how much longer can you keep this up?" "As long as I need to," Marta replied evenly. "I'm not here to negotiate, Raphael. I'm here to deliver." His smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Bold words, but boldness has a price. Are you sure you're willing to pay it?" Marta leaned forward, meeting his gaze head-on. "If that's a threat, it won't work. I know what you're doing, and I won't let you sabotage this." Raphael chuckled softly, setting down his cup. "Sabotage? Marta, I'm simply testing you, and so far, you're holding up better than I expected. But remember, this game isn't just about winning. It's about survival." Marta's chest tightened, but she refused to let him see her fear. "Then I suggest you start watching closely, because I'm not just here to survive, I'm here to win." Raphael regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. Show me what you've got." As he stood and walked away, Marta exhaled, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The battle was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for Beatriz or the company, she was fighting for herself, for the chance to prove she was more than anyone had ever given her credit for. The city's skyline gleamed under the setting sun, its golden hues bathing the skyscrapers in a fleeting warmth. Marta stared out of her office window, her reflection barely visible against the backdrop of the bustling world beyond. She had come so far in the past few weeks, unearthing truths and battling forces she never thought she'd confront. Yet, for every small victory, the looming shadow of Raphael and the weight of Beatriz's mistakes pressed harder against her. Her desk was a battlefield of documents and charts, each one detailing the fragile balance she was desperately trying to maintain. The financial recovery plan was working, albeit slowly. Marta had managed to renegotiate key contracts and rally reluctant partners, but the deadlines Raphael had set were closing in. Every hour mattered now, and the margin for error was razor thin. The knock at her office door startled her. Beatrice stepped inside, her face a mixture of weariness and resolve. Marta could see that her sister was trying, but years of self-preservation and denial were difficult habits to break. "I spoke with one of our investors today," Beatrice said, her voice tentative. "They're willing to give us an extension on their payment, but they want assurances." "What kind of assurances?" Marta asked, already wary. Beatrice hesitated, then handed Marta a folder. "They want a stake in the company, a significant one." Marta flipped through the papers, her stomach sinking. "This isn't just a stake, Beatrice. This is control. If we agree to this, they'll own more of the company than you do." "I know," Beatrice admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we don't have many options left." Marta slammed the folder shut, the frustration boiling over. "How did it get this bad? How did you let it come to this?" Beatrice didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat in the chair across from Marta, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Because I was afraid," she said finally, "afraid of failing, of losing everything. I thought if I just kept pushing, if I pretended everything was fine, it would be." Marta leaned back in her chair, the anger draining from her as quickly as it had come. She could see the truth in Beatrice's words, the fear that had driven her to make reckless decisions. And as much as she wanted to blame her sister, Marta knew that fear wasn't an easy thing to overcome. "We'll figure it out," Marta said, her voice softening. "But giving up control isn't the answer. There has to be another way." Beatrice nodded, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. "I hope you're right." As Beatrice left, Marta returned to the papers on her desk, her mind racing. She couldn't let the company fall into the hands of opportunistic investors, but the alternatives were limited. The clock was ticking, and every decision felt like a gamble. Later that night, as Marta sifted through more financial records, a knock on her apartment door pulled her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, and a flicker of unease crept over her as she approached. When she opened the door, Raphael stood there, his expression calm, but his presence unmistakably commanding. "Raphael," Marta said, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her stomach. "What are you doing here?" "I thought we should talk," he replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're making progress, but you're also making mistakes." Marta crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And what mistakes would those be?" "You're too focused on the numbers," Raphael said, his tone almost casual. "This isn't just about balancing the books, it's about power, leverage. You need to start thinking like someone who wants to win, not just survive." Marta bristled at his words, though a part of her knew he was right. "And what would you suggest, Raphael? That I start manipulating people the way you do?" Raphael's lips curved into a faint smile. "If you want to play in this world, Marta, you need to understand the rules. Sometimes the ends justify the means." Marta shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "That's where we're different, Raphael. I'm not willing to sacrifice my integrity for a quick fix." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Integrity is admirable, Marta, but in this world, it's also a liability." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Marta alone with his words echoing in her mind. She wanted to reject everything he stood for, but she couldn't ignore the weight of his warning. The path she was on wasn't just about saving a company. It was about navigating a battlefield where every decision carried consequences. As the city lights flickered on outside her window, Marta sat back at her desk, determination hardening in her chest. Raphael's world may have been one of manipulation and control, but she would prove there was another way to win. She had to, because failure wasn't just personal anymore. It was a betrayal of everything she stood for. The weight of the past weeks bore down on Marta as she stood in the dimly lit office conference room. It was a place she'd grown to know intimately, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. Outside the window, the city glowed like a distant dream, each light a reminder of the countless lives continuing obliviously, unaffected by the chaos unraveling here. Marta's hands trembled as she spread out the final set of documents on the table. These were the culmination of every sleepless night, every hard-fought negotiation. She had done everything within her power to pull the company back from the brink. But as she looked at the numbers, a hollow ache settled in her chest. It wasn't enough. The door creaked open and Beatrice entered, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She looked older than Marta had ever seen her, tired, worn, and stripped of the polish that had once defined her. Yet there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes. Humility, perhaps, or gratitude. "I got your message," Beatrice said, sitting across from Marta. "What's the verdict?" Marta hesitated, her throat tightening. "We've stabilized some areas, but the debts, they're too large to overcome without significant sacrifices." Beatrice's face fell, but she nodded slowly, as if she had expected nothing less. "What kind of sacrifices?" Marta pushed a folder toward her, her fingers brushing the edge. "We'll have to liquidate non-essential assets. The mansion, the luxury cars, even the private jet. It won't fix everything, but it'll buy us time." Beatrice opened the folder, her eyes scanning the list of assets. Her jaw tightened as she read, the enormity of the losses sinking in. "This is everything, Marta. Everything I've worked for." "It's not everything," Marta said softly. "It's just things. The company can still survive. You can rebuild." Beatrice closed the folder, her hands trembling. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have a choice," Marta replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "This is what it takes to fix what's broken." Beatrice leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Then quietly, Beatrice said, "Thank you, Marta, for everything." The words caught Marta off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Instead, she gave a small nod, the weight of their shared struggle settling on her shoulders. The next morning, Marta met with Raphael in the sleek boardroom of his downtown office. He greeted her with his usual air of composed confidence, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a predatory gleam that set her on edge. "You've been busy," Raphael said, gesturing for her to sit. "I hear you've been making some bold moves." "I've been making necessary moves," Marta replied, her tone clipped. "The company isn't out of the woods yet, but we're getting there." Raphael leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Impressive. But boldness alone won't guarantee success. You still owe me results." Marta's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to argue with you, Raphael. I'm here to make a deal." His eyebrows lifted, his interest peaked. "A deal, and what exactly are you offering?" "I'll ensure the company turns a profit within 6 months, Marta said, her voice steady. "But in return, you back off. No more meddling, no more threats." Raphael chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "You've got nerve, Marta. I'll give you that. But what makes you think you can deliver on such a promise?" "Because I've already proven I can," she shot back. "I've stabilized operations, renegotiated contracts, and cut unnecessary costs. All I need is time." Raphael studied her for a long moment, his sharp gaze probing. Finally, he nodded. 6 months. But if you fail, there won't be a second chance." Marta stood, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I won't fail." As she walked out of the office, her heart pounded in her chest. The stakes had never been higher, but for the first time, she felt in control. She had faced Raphael on his terms and held her ground. Now, all that remained was to deliver. That evening, Marta returned to the office to find Beatrice waiting for her. Her sister held an envelope in her hands, her expression unreadable. "What's this?" Marta asked. Beatrice hesitated before handing it to her. "It's a letter from our father." Marta's breath caught as she opened the envelope, her hands shaking. The letter was old, the paper yellowed with age. As she read the familiar handwriting, a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. The words revealed secrets Marta had never imagined, truths about their family, their inheritance, and the sacrifices their father had made to protect them. "This changes everything," Marta whispered, her voice barely audible. Beatrice nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't. You deserve to know." Marta's hands tightened around the letter as a new resolve took hold. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place, revealing a picture far more complex than she had ever realized. And as the truth came into focus, so did her path forward. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city as Marta stood on the balcony of the office's highest floor. Below her, the world moved on, unaware of the seismic shifts that had taken place within the walls of Beatrice's empire. Tonight was different. Tonight, she would close a chapter she hadn't realized she'd been writing all her life. Inside the boardroom, Beatrice and a handful of key investors waited. The air was thick with anticipation as Marta stepped through the glass doors, a folder tucked under her arm. She felt their eyes on her, measuring her, questioning her. For the first time, she didn't flinch under their scrutiny. She belonged here. "Thank you for coming," Marta began, her voice calm but commanding. She placed the folder on the table, her movements deliberate. "The past few months have been challenging, but we've reached a turning point. I'm here to present a proposal that will not only save this company, but ensure its long-term success." As she outlined her plan, detailing the recovery strategy, the renegotiated contracts, and the projected growth, Marta could feel the room shift. The skepticism she had faced so often was replaced by something she had rarely encountered: respect. When she finished, the silence was deafening. Beatrice, seated at the head of the table, was the first to speak. "This is extraordinary, Marta. I never thought we'd get here." "It wasn't easy," Marta admitted, her eyes locking with Beatrice's. "But it was worth it." As the investors began murmuring their agreement, Marta allowed herself a moment to breathe. The weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet pride. She had done it, not just for the company, but for herself. After the meeting, Beatrice approached her, her expression softer than Marta had ever seen. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything, for underestimating you, for putting you in this position. I don't know how to thank you." Marta smiled, a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "You don't need to thank me, Beatrice. Just do better, for yourself, for everyone who depends on you." The two sisters stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them stronger than any words. For the first time in years, Marta felt the divide between them begin to close. Later that night, as Marta returned to her apartment, she found a message waiting for her. It was from Raphael. The words were brief, but carried an undeniable weight. "You've proven your point. I'll step back. For now." Marta stared at the screen, a mix of relief and caution coursing through her. She had won this round, but she knew Raphael wasn't the type to walk away entirely. Still, it was a victory, and she would take it. Standing in the quiet of her apartment, Marta let out a long breath. She thought of everything it had taken to get here, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the battles fought and won. She wasn't the same person who had walked into Beatrice's mansion all those weeks ago. She was stronger, sharper, and more certain of her place in the world. And speaking of strength, what did you think of Marta's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear what stood out to you most in this story. Did you feel Marta's struggles, her victories? Let us know how her story inspired you. As Marta gazed out her window, the city lights twinkling like a million tiny possibilities, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. This wasn't the end of her story, it was only the beginning.